Deep beneath the mountains, in chambers of stone, untouched by sunlight for ages, something ancient is stirring. A great and terrible presence wakes from dreams of fire and shadow, his scales still warm with the memory of volcanic slumber. This is Ancalagon, last of the great dragons, sole survivor of a race that once darkened the skies with their majesty and might. For centuries he has slept, hidden within the fortress of Thangorodrim, a place steeped in legend and drenched in the echoes of a war that reshaped the world. But now, something has called him back. Not the sound of battle, not the march of armies, but a subtle, unsettling shift in the very air around him. A new presence is near. Something that does not belong. He feels it in the stones, in the whispers of heat rising from the deep vents, a disturbance that resonates with the oldest and most guarded of dragon fears. This is no ordinary intruder. This is a threat that understands what dragons truly dread, not swords or spells, but the unraveling of memory itself, the exploitation of sorrow, the weaponization of loss. Ancalagon's mind floods with visions of the past, the Siege of Thangorodrim, the fall of his kind, the silence that followed, and he knows, with a certainty that chills even his fiery heart, that what comes now does not seek conquest. It seeks corruption. It seeks to use the very essence of dragon fear against whatever remains of their legacy, and so a choice lies before him, heavy as mountain stone. Will he remain in the depths, hidden and silent, allowing history to repeat itself in shadows, or will he rise one last time, to face what lesser beings could not? This is not just a story about a dragon. It is a story about memory, about what we choose to carry from the past, and what we must release to protect the future. It is about fear and the courage it takes to confront it, wherever you are right now, whatever hour of the day or night has brought you here. We would love to know what part of the world you're listening from. Let us know in the comments below, because stories like this are meant to be shared across time, across distance, across imagination itself. So settle in. Let the tale begin. Slowly, with the deliberate care of one who has not moved in centuries, Ancalagon uncoils his immense body from the stone cradle of his slumber. The air in his inner sanctum, once still and heavy with the breath of the mountain itself, now stirs as his wings unfold, sending eddies of ancient dust swirling through the gloom. He pushes forward, his scales scraping against volcanic rock, polished smooth by ages of his own presence. The great archway that serves as the entrance to his lair is just wide enough for him to pass through, and as he emerges into the wider caverns beyond, a wind heavy with the taste of ash and forgotten things greets him. This is not the clean, fiery breath of the mountain's heart. This wind carries a different scent, one that prickles at the edges of his ancient mind with a troubling electric tang. His massive claws click against the stone floor as he moves through the colossal ruins that were once the pride of his kind. Towers that scrape the ceiling now lie in shattered heaps, and vast halls stand silent and empty, their grandeur reduced to rubble and memory. He moves through this graveyard of his own history, his golden eyes slitted like a cat's, missing no detail, and then he sees it, something new amidst the old decay. Streaks of blacker ash mar the walls, not the random scorching of a lava flow, but patterns, deliberate, almost script-like marks, burned into the stone with a heat that feels different from dragon fire. It is colder, sharper, a magic that sears rather than consumes. He lowers his great head, his nostrils flaring as he draws in the scent of the place. The magical residue clinging to the scorch marks is faint but unmistakable. It feels alien, the work of an intelligence not born of this mountain, yet it also carries a haunting, deeply familiar echo. It is like a half-remembered melody from a dream, a chord that resonates with the oldest songs of his own creation. This is no random trespass. This is not some band of treasure hunters or foolish adventurers seeking glory. They would have been turned to cinders by the mountain's innate defenses or gotten lost in the labyrinthine tunnels. Whoever, or whatever, has come here moved with purpose and power, bypassing wards that have stood for millennia. They are not here for gold or conquest. The evidence points to a far more unsettling goal. The intruder is seeking something intangible, something woven into the very stone and memory of Thangorodrim itself. They are hunting for echoes. The realization settles upon Ancalagon with the weight of the mountain above him. He is not alone, and this other presence seeks not to claim the dragon's home, but to plunder the deepest, most guarded vaults of dragon memory. His thoughts race, sifting through eons of inherited knowledge, and they snag on the oldest legend of all, the fire of creation, the primordial spark from which the first dragons were forged, a power thought to be spent and lost at the world's dawn. Could it be that some ember of that first flame still sleeps here, and that this intruder has come to wake it? The thought is as terrifying as it is awe-inspiring, for such power in the wrong hands could unmake all that remains. The faint, shimmering trail of magic leads Ancalagon deeper into the mountain's heart, through corridors that have not felt the weight of a living creature in centuries. The air grows colder, the silence so profound he can hear the subtle cracking of stone as the ancient fortress settles around him. The residue he follows is like a ghostly thread, pulling him onward, and it finally terminates at a vast, circular chamber whose domed ceiling has partially given way, allowing a single shaft of pale, dust-moted light to cut through the darkness. This was once an observatory, a place where his kind once charted the movements of stars and sought to read the patterns of fate in the heavens above. Now it is a tomb of knowledge, its grandeur reduced to a jumble of fallen pillars and shattered crystal apparatus. It is on the curved walls, however, that the true story is told. Where the rock is still intact, intricate carvings stretch from floor to what remains of the ceiling. These are not the grand, public monuments that speak of glorious victories and noble sacrifices, the history he was raised to believe. These are something else entirely. They are raw, unfiltered, and devastating. Ancalagon's immense form goes still as his eyes trace the scenes depicted. He sees the familiar shapes of dragons locked in combat, but not against elves or men. They are turned against each other. Their majestic forms are contorted not with rage, but with something far more unsettling, pure, unadulterated terror. One carving shows a great worm recoiling from its own kin, its wings raised defensively as if warding off a phantom. Another depicts a cluster of dragons, their heads thrown back not in a triumphant roar, but in a silent scream of confusion and panic, their fire spilling uncontrolled and harming their own allies. The narrative unfolding across the stone is a history he never knew. It speaks of a siege not just from without, but from within. It tells of a fracture in the heart of dragonkind, a moment of profound weakness where some primal fear was weaponized against them, turning their immense power into their own undoing. This is the revelation that strikes him with the force of a physical blow. The proud, unified legacy he carries, the story of a noble race, standing defiant against overwhelming odds until a tragic, but honorable, end is a lie. Or at best, a half-truth polished smooth by time. The full history is far more complex, far more painful. It is a history of fear, of inner demons given form, of a brother turning on brother in the blinding fog of panic. This is the forgotten truth. This is the secret Thangorodrim has kept buried in its deepest bones, and in a sudden, chilling moment of clarity, he understands the intruder's true purpose. They are not here to steal a physical object or claim a throne. They are an archaeologist of anguish, a collector of catastrophes. They are using these forgotten truths, these carvings of fear and betrayal, as a key. This magical residue is not merely a trail. It is a tool, a solvent being used to weaken the psychic and magical barriers that guard the mountain's oldest secrets. By resonating with this specific, terrible frequency of historical trauma, the intruder is attempting to resonate with whatever power still sleeps here, perhaps the very ember of the fire of creation itself, and align it with that ancient fear. They seek not to control the power through strength, but to manipulate it through its deepest, most vulnerable memory, to make it remember its own moment of greatest weakness, and in doing so, bend it to their will. The intruder isn't just in the mountain. They are playing a symphony on its oldest, most painful scars, and Ancalagon is only now beginning to hear the music. The faint sound is so out of place, it takes Ancalagon a moment to even recognize it as a melody. It is not the groan of shifting stone or the hiss of a steam vent. It is a soft, lilting hum that drifts through the labyrinthine tunnels, a thread of sound weaving through the oppressive silence. It feels both alien and deeply alluring, a siren's call in the heart of a tomb. His every instinct screams of a trap, yet his immense curiosity, a trait long dormant, stirs. He moves with a predator's grace that belies his colossal size, his scales whispering against the rock as he follows the ethereal sound, his great body melting into the deep shadows cast by the cavern walls. The humming grows clearer, resolving into a complex, repeating chant. It is a language he does not know, yet its rhythm seems to resonate with the very stone around him, making the ancient volcanic glass vibrate in sympathy. Peering around the edge of a massive, broken pillar, he finally sees the source. Bathed in an eerie, pulsing light is a slender human figure, a woman, her back to him, her focus entirely consumed by the object hovering between her hands. It is a crystal, roughly the size of her head, and it throbs with a soft, internal luminescence that casts shifting patterns of amethyst and cobalt across the surrounding walls. With each note of her chant, the crystal pulses brighter, as if breathing in time with her song. Ancalagon watches, his ancient mind racing to decipher the scene. This is the intruder, this fragile, solitary creature. Her presence alone should have been snuffed out by the mountain's latent dangers. Yet here she stands, not only unharmed, but seemingly in communion with the fortress itself. He can feel it now, a subtle pull, a draining sensation. The crystal is not just glowing, it is drawing something in. He feels a faint but distinct tug at the edges of his own consciousness, a stirring of old, buried emotions the ghost of a panic long suppressed, the echo of a betrayal that still stung. The crystal is feeding. It is drawing upon the residual emotional energy that saturates this place, the psychic scar tissue left by the ancient siege. It is harvesting dragon fear. This lore seeker, this Elara, works with a fervent, almost desperate concentration. In her mind, this is not a desecration, but a sacred duty. She believes the stories she has uncovered in forgotten texts, that the catastrophic energy of the siege, the raw, unrefined terror of the dragons, is a primal force that was never meant to be unleashed. She sees it as a poison that has infected the very ley lines of the world, a wound that has never healed. Her intention, born of scholarly obsession and a misguided sense of heroism, is to gather this scattered, harmful energy. She seeks to contain it within the crystal, to purify it through her star-born melodies, and to transmute that concentrated fear into something else entirely, a force for balance, a shield against coming calamities foretold in celestial alignments. She truly believes she is healing the mountain, stitching an old wound closed. But Ancalagon, who has lived through the reality she has only read about, sees the profound danger she is too naive to comprehend. She is a child playing with a smoldering ember, unaware she stands in a powder keg. The fear she so delicately harvests is not a passive resource to be bottled and refined. It is a live nerve connected to the mountain's heart. By drawing it out, by concentrating it into that single, volatile point, she is not calming a storm. She is creating a lightning rod for one. Her actions are not sealing a wound. They are picking at a scab over a festering infection. The very act of amplification, of giving this ancient terror a focal point, risks awakening the very things she hopes to neutralize. She is calling out into the dark, and Ancalagon knows, with a dread that turns his blood cold, that something else in the deep, dark places of Thangorodrim is beginning to answer. The silence of the observatory shattered, not with the crash of falling stone or the hiss of steam, but with a voice that was itself a force of nature. Who dares to plunder the memories of the dead? The words, spoken in a tongue older than the mountains themselves, rolled through the chamber like thunder, vibrating through the stone floor and shaking dust from the high ceiling. Ancalagon did not merely emerge from the shadows. He filled the space, his colossal form a wall of scale and muscle, an ancient fury, his golden eyes fixed on the lone figure by the pulsing crystal. Elara stumbled back, her chant cut short, one hand flying to her chest, as if to steady her own heart. The crystal flared erratically at the sudden silence, its light strobing across the carvings of terrified dragons. For a terrifying moment, she was pure instinct, a small creature facing an apex predator from the dawn of time. But then, something remarkable happened. Her fear did not consume her. Instead, it seemed to crystallize into a fierce, defiant resolve. She slowly lowered her hand, straightening her spine to stand her ground before the living embodiment of legend. "I am no plunderer," she called out, her voice thin and reedy compared to his, yet unwavering. "I am a seeker, Elara of the Starry Vault, and I am here to avert a doom, not to cause one." Ancalagon's great head tilted, a gesture of both curiosity and menace. "You harvest fear as if it were a crop. You trespass in a tomb and call it salvation. Explain this doom you claim to serve." His voice was lower now, a low rumble that promised incineration if her answer proved false. Elara took a steadying breath, her eyes not on the dragon's teeth or claws, but on the intelligent, ancient fire in his gaze. She spoke of her life's work, deciphering celestial prophecies etched on ancient astronomical devices. She told him of a pattern she had uncovered, a convergence in the stars that spoke of a great unraveling, a wave of psychic nullification that would sweep across the land, silencing magic and snuffing out life, not with a bang, but with a whimper. A silent, creeping end to wonder itself. Her solution, drawn from fragmented texts, even older than the dragon before her, was as audacious as it was desperate. She sought the heart fear, not the simple emotion, but the concentrated, primal essence of the dragon's terror from the siege, the most potent, raw emotional energy ever recorded. Her theory was one of desperate alchemy. She believed that this concentrated dread, when purified and inverted through her star melodies, could act as a colossal anchor, a counter-frequency so powerful it could stabilize the unraveling reality and hold the line against the coming silence. She saw herself not as a thief, but as a surgeon, performing a dangerous operation to remove a poisoned shard from the world's soul and use its very toxicity as the antidote. Ancalagon listened, his immense stillness more unnerving than any movement. He heard the sincerity in her voice, the genuine belief that lit her from within. She was not lying, but his senses, honed over millennia, reached far deeper than her words. As she spoke of stars and salvation, he felt the subtle fingerprints of another intelligence, layered beneath her own. Her theories were just a little too neat, her prophetic readings a little too convenient. The texts she found, were they truly discovered by chance, or were they placed in her path? The resonance of her crystal, the specific frequency she used to draw out the fear energy, it was perfect. Too perfect. It was not the clumsy work of a well-intentioned scholar. It was the precision tool of a master manipulator. He understood then. Elara was a pawn, a brilliant, passionate, and utterly deceived instrument in a game she could not comprehend. Her noble goal was merely the bait, the compelling story used to lure a seeker of her particular talents to this specific place to perform this exact ritual. She believed she was gathering the heart fear to save the world, but the older, colder force guiding her from the shadows had a very different purpose. They did not want to purify the fear, they wanted to consume it. They craved that raw, undiluted power, not for creation, but for absolute domination. To wield a weapon that could paralyze entire armies with inherited terror, to break the wills of nations by making them relive the worst moments of history. Elara was the lockpick, and she didn't even know she was turning in the hands of a thief. The tension in the air, thick with the aftermath of revelation, shattered in an instant. The ground beneath their feet did not merely shake, it convulsed. A violent upward heave that sent chunks of the observatory's ceiling crashing down around them. Elara's crystal, which had dimmed to a soft hum during their confrontation, erupted. It was no longer a tool, but a star-going supernova, blazing with a searing, painful white light that scorched the very air and cast monstrous, leaping shadows across the ancient walls. The psychic pressure in the chamber spiked into agony, a silent scream of amplified fear that felt like needles driven into the mind. From the newly opened fissures in the floor, where the quake had torn the rock apart, figures emerged. They did not climb out, They flowed upward like smoke given form, their movements unnaturally smooth and silent. Their robes were the color of ash and dried blood, tattered and ancient, and their faces were hidden deep within shadowed hoods. But their hands were visible pale, long-fingered, and covered in intricate, glowing tattoos that pulsed with the same rhythm as the crazed crystal. They moved with a chilling familiarity, as if they were not intruders but caretakers returning to a home they had never truly left. The lead figure, taller than the others, lunged not for Ancalagon or Elara, but for the source of the energy. His tattooed hands closed around the blazing crystal, and instead of being burned, he seemed to drink the light into his skin. The violent flaring ceased instantly, the energy now contained within him, making the symbols on his arms burn with a vicious purple-black fire. He held the crystal aloft, and a sound like dry, rasping laughter echoed in the chamber. "The harvest is complete," he hissed, his voice a multitude of whispers scraping together. "The vessel is prepared. The symphony of fear awaits its conductor." He turned his hooded gaze upon them, and though no eyes were visible, the weight of his contempt was a physical blow. "You have our gratitude, instruments." The scholar, so clever, so easily led by prophecies we etched into the stars for her to find. He gestured dismissively at Elara, who stood frozen in horrified understanding. And the last beast, guarding embers he does not understand, drawn out by the very fears he sought to bury. He chuckled, a sound like grinding stone. "Your confrontation, your heightened emotions, the dragon's defensive rage, the human's desperate guilt, it was the final seasoning, the perfect catalyst to awaken the slumbering energy within the stone. You have not averted a doom, you have perfected its key." The truth unfolded in that moment, cruel and absolute. Elara's entire quest, her life's work, had been a script written by these hidden masters. The celestial convergence, the prophecy of unraveling, it was all an elaborate lie, a narrative crafted to guide a sensitive, powerful individual to this place, at this time, to perform a very specific ritual. They needed her unique talents, her star-born magic, to gently coax the ancient fear energy from the stone and prepare it for the taking. They could never have simply stolen it. It was too diffuse, too interwoven with the mountain's essence. It required a delicate hand, a sympathetic resonance that their own corrosive magic could never provide. She was the harvester, they were the reapers. And Ancalagon, he was the final ingredient. His presence, his anger, his own deep well of ancestral memory acted as an amplifier and a focusing lens. The cultists had orchestrated this entire confrontation, using the mountain's own history as a stage, to create the perfect conditions for their harvest. Now, with the crystal charged not just with historical fear, but with the fresh, potent terror of betrayal and realization, their goal was within reach. The leader's voice dropped to a guttural whisper, thick with malevolent triumph. "This power born of dragon anguish will not be used to mend your world. It will be used to reforge a weapon that broke armies and crumbled fortresses, a weapon that does not kill the body, but shatters the will. We will not conquer lands. We will conquer hope itself, and all will know the absolute dominion of fear." A jet of incandescent fury erupted from Ancalagon's maw, not aimed at the retreating figures, but as a barrier between them and the stunned lore seeker. The flame roared across the chamber's width, a blazing curtain of orange and white that scorched the very air and sent the cultists recoiling into the deeper shadows of a fissure with hissed curses. The heat was a tangible wall, a declaration. In that single, instinctive act, the ancient dragon had made his first choice. He would not let them simply take their prize and their pawn. The chamber fell into a fractured silence, broken only by the crackle of dying embers and Elara's ragged, terrified breaths. She stood shielded by the fading wall of heat, her eyes wide as she stared at the colossal creature who had, for reasons she could not fathom, just saved her life. Ancalagon's own thoughts were a storm of conflicting instincts. The primal part of him, the part forged in war and betrayal, screamed that she was the cause of this. Her ignorance, her arrogance, had handed their enemy the very weapon they sought. She was a liability, a complication. To trust a human, a creature of such brief life and fleeting loyalty, was the height of folly. His kind had learned that lesson in blood and fire. The simpler path, the safer path, was clear. He would turn from her now, use his immense strength and intimate knowledge of the mountain's veins to pursue the cult alone. He could move faster without her, strike harder without the burden of protecting something so fragile. But a deeper, more calculating wisdom, born of centuries of solitary contemplation, began to assert itself. He watched the last of the robed figures vanish into the mountain's depths, and he understood the truth of their mockery. They had not just stolen a crystal, they had orchestrated this entire confrontation. They had used Elara's unique talents as precisely as a master smith uses a hammer, and they had used his own rage as the anvil upon which their weapon was tempered. They understood dragon fire, but they also understood dragon fear. They understood the mind. This was not a foe that could be defeated by flame and claw alone. Their power was subtler, more insidious. It was a poison that worked on memory and emotion, and this human, for all her catastrophic mistakes, possessed knowledge he did not. She understood the nature of the crystal, the rituals they were likely to perform, the star-born magic they had perverted. She had studied their movements, deciphered their false prophecies. She was in a terrible twist of fate, the only living expert on the very enemy they now faced. To discard her would be to willfully blind himself. The cult moved in shadows he could not see. She held a torch, however recklessly she had been waving it about. The enemy believed them divided, a beast and a fool to be manipulated and discarded. Their greatest advantage now would be to do the one thing the cult would never expect: unite. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken calculations and the lingering scent of ozone and fear. Ancalagon slowly turned his great head, his golden eyes fixing on Elara. She flinched but did not look away, her own expression, a raw map of dawning horror at her own role in this catastrophe, and a fragile, desperate hope. The dragon's voice, when it came, was a low rumble that vibrated through the stone beneath her feet, devoid of its earlier fury, but heavy with an immense and grave seriousness. They play a game with the board and the pieces, he intoned, the words feeling less like sound and more like a shift in the air itself. They believe they have already won, because they believe we will remain pieces. To stop them, we cannot play by their rules. Your knowledge and my strength are now a single thread. Will it become a rope to pull us from this abyss, or a noose that finishes their work for them? The choice is made. The path forward is together. His massive head gestured toward the dark fissure. Their trail is fresh. Speak of what you know as we walk. There is no more time for silence. Elara's voice, though still trembling, found a new thread of steel as she met the dragon's unwavering gaze. They used me, she stated, the words not an excuse, but a stark admission of a truth that was settling into her bones. They laid a trail of false stars for me to follow, and my pride blinded me to the darkness behind the light. But I did not come here entirely unprepared. I have studied the old maps, the ones your kind carved when this mountain was young and whole. I know pathways even they may have forgotten, routes that run like veins through the stone, down to the deepest forges and the oldest vaults. She drew a steadying breath, her hands clenched at her sides, and I learned their rituals, the cadence of their chants, the symbols they used to focus their will. I thought I was learning to purify, but I was learning their language. Let me use it against them. Grant me your protection, and I will give you every secret I possess. I need to make this right. Ancalagon regarded her for a long, silent moment, the heat of his breath stirring the ash at her feet. He saw the shame in her eyes, but beneath it, a fierce and burning need for redemption. Her offer was not one of bargaining, but of atonement. She was not trying to save herself. She was offering herself as a weapon, the only one she had. To refuse her would be to ignore a vital tool. To accept her was to tether himself to a creature whose very nature was fallibility. With a low rumble that was more sigh than growl, he gave a single, slow dip of his massive head. Your knowledge will be our guide. Your life will be under my wing. Do not make me regret the shadow I cast over you. The alliance was forged not in trust, but in dire necessity. A fragile pact between ancient power and mortal resolve, bound by a shared enemy and a shared failure. Their descent began not as a march, but as a slow, deliberate immersion into the mountain's wounded heart. The wide, grand halls of the upper ruins were soon behind them, replaced by narrow, spiraling staircases, hewn directly into the living rock and tight passageways that forced even Ancalagon to turn his great body sideways to pass. Elara took the lead, her form small and flickering in the dim, eldritch light she conjured from a crystal shard at her wrist. She moved with a scholar's certainty, her fingers occasionally brushing against almost invisible markings on the walls. A subtle rune here, a faded arrow there, the forgotten signage of a lost civilization. This way, she would murmur, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried in the suffocating silence. This conduit was used to channel volcanic heat to the lower forges. It will take us down, bypassing the main thoroughfares they are likely to guard. With every step downward, the air changed. It grew heavier, thicker, tasting of centuries of compressed ash, and something else, something metallic and sour, like old blood and ozone. It was a physical weight on the tongue, a pressure in the lungs, but the change was more than atmospheric. It was psychic. The very stone around them seemed to breathe out a slow, endless exhalation of memory. Faint, disjointed whispers brushed against the edge of hearing, not in any language, but in raw emotion. A sudden, cold spike of panic from a long-dead guardian. The searing heat of a betrayal so fresh, it felt like it happened yesterday. The crushing weight of despair from a worm trapped in a collapsing tunnel. The stones were not inert. They were a recording slate of anguish, and their descent was a journey backward through layers of concentrated sorrow. Ancalagon, usually a creature of immense, implacable presence, seemed to grow more subdued, his great head lowered, his movements becoming almost cautious. He was not just walking through a tunnel, he was wading through the ghost of his own history. Every whisper was a face he half remembered, a roar that echoed in his soul. For Elara, the experience was overwhelming, a constant low-grade assault on her senses that made her heart hammer and her breath catch. She kept her focus on the path, on the rhythm of her own breathing, using the academic puzzle of navigation as a lifeline to keep from being swept away by the emotional undertow. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. The mountain was speaking for them, and its only language was a warning, repeated in endless variations. This has happened before. This pain is a cycle. Turn back. The passage Elara chose narrowed sharply, the smooth, worked stone of the upper conduits, giving way to a jagged, raw tunnel that felt less like a hallway and more like the inside of a wound. The air, already thick with memory, grew viscous and hot, humming with a low, dissonant frequency that set their teeth on edge. "This is it," Elara whispered, her voice strained. The texts mentioned a path of echoes, a final gauntlet protecting the deepest sanctums. They said it was personalized. She glanced back at Ancalagon, her light glinting off the concern in her eyes. "It doesn't just guard, it reflects." No sooner had the words left her mouth than the tunnel ahead seemed to dissolve. The rough-hewn walls melted away, replaced by a panoramic, horrifyingly familiar vista. They were no longer underground. They stood on a high, wind-swept ledge, overlooking the fiery chaos of the Siege of Thangorodrim in its final, most desperate hours. The sky was black with smoke and the leathery wings of countless dragons, but these were not the majestic creatures of legend. They were beings of pure, unhinged terror. A massive worm, its scales glistening with obsidian fury, turned not on the elven battalions below, but on its own wingmate, its jaws closing around a neck in a spray of searing blood and a shriek of agony that was both physical and psychic. Phantom arrows whistled past their heads, not aimed at them, but the intention behind them. The cold, focused hatred felt as real as any weapon. Elara cried out, ducking instinctively as a spectral dragon's tail swept through the space she occupied. It passed through her without impact, but it left behind a wave of debilitating despair, so potent it nearly drove her to her knees. "They're not real." She gasped, trying to cling to logic, but Ancalagon was not beside her. He was lost. His great body was rigid, his head held high, but his eyes were wide, seeing not an illusion, but a memory. This was not a generic recreation of the war. This was his war, the worm that had just turned on its kin. He knew its name, the particular stench of the specific type of elven fire arrows burning the air. He remembered the unique pain they caused. The trap was not designed for a human scholar. It was designed for him. It was feeding on his own recollections, using the unique fingerprint of his trauma to power its horrors. "Ancalagon," Elara shouted, her voice barely a whisper against the roar of the phantom battle. He didn't seem to hear her. He was trapped in a waking nightmare, a prisoner of his own past. She watched in horror as a jet of illusory flame, summoned from the memory of a specific, treacherous dragon he had once called brother, washed over him. Ancalagon roared, a sound of genuine pain and fury, and recoiled, his scales smoking where the phantom fire had touched. The trap was a masterpiece of psychological cruelty. The flames had no heat a human could feel, but to Ancalagon, whose memory supplied every detail of that exact, searing agony, the pain was utterly, devastatingly real. It could break him without leaving a single physical mark. In that moment of shared terror, a desperate realization struck Elara. She couldn't fight this for him. She couldn't reason with a ghost. The only way through was for him to lead. Ancalagon, listen to me, she cried, forcing her voice through the cacophony. It's using your fear. Your memory is the map. Don't fight the illusion, read it. Her words, sharp and clear, pierced the fog of his anguish. Read it. The concept was so alien to a warrior's mind, it created a moment of cognitive stillness. He was trying to battle a shadow, to defeat a memory, and in doing so, he was giving it all his power. But what if he stopped fighting? What if he did the one thing his pride and pain had never allowed him to do? He forced his eyes open, making himself truly look at the nightmare unfolding around him. He saw the specific formation of the elven archers, a tactic used only on the third day of the siege. He saw the unique sigil on the wing of the dragon turning on its ally, a sigil belonging to a flight that had been stationed near the western lava flows. He saw the patterns not as random horror, but as data points. Each terrible image was a landmark. Each wave of fear was a signpost. His voice, when it came, was a raw scrape, but it was focused. The western flow, they are herding us, pushing us toward the chasm where the earth gave way. He took a step, not away from a phantom spear, but toward a specific, crumbling section of the illusory battlefield. This is not the main assault. This is a diversion, a feint from the south, to draw forces away from the heart vault. He was no longer a victim of the memory, he was an analyst of it. The very fear that had paralyzed him was now his compass. The cult's method was revealed not through weakness, but through a brutal, intimate understanding of how fear worked. They did not create generic terror, they curated personal, historical anguish, and to find their stronghold, he didn't need to outrun his fears. He needed to follow them to their source. Stay close, he rumbled to Elara, his movement now decisive. He led them not away from the screaming phantoms and searing flames, but through them, navigating the chaos with a grim, newfound certainty. Where the illusions were thickest, the emotional resonance the most painful, he knew they were on the right path. The cult's lair would be at the epicenter of this curated nightmare, the point where the anguish was most concentrated. His greatest weakness had indeed become his key, not by conquering it, but by accepting it as the most detailed map he possessed. The path to victory was paved with the stones of his own most terrible memories. The narrow, fear-saturated tunnel finally opened into a space that felt less like a room and more like a sealed tomb of forgotten truths. The air, which had been thick with the psychic residue of anguish, here was perfectly still and cold, preserved in a silence so absolute it felt like a physical presence. Ancalagon had to lower his head and fold his wings tightly to his body to fit inside, his immense form seeming to shrink the chamber further. The walls were not rough-hewn rock, but smooth, polished obsidian, and upon their dark, glassy surfaces, scenes were painted not with pigment, but with some form of captured light that still glimmered faintly after centuries. This was no record of glorious battle or noble history. This was a confession. The murals unfolded in a continuous, horrifying narrative, They showed dragons in their prime, their forms majestic and powerful, soaring in coordinated flight or gathered in council. But in every scene, a subtle corruption was at work. Ethereal, almost beautiful tendrils of shimmering energy, depicted in hues of violet and sickly green, wove through the air, connecting to the dragons' heads not like chains, but like delicate, parasitic vines. The dragons' expressions were not ones of rage or battle lust, but of dawning confusion, paranoia, and a terror so profound it was a physical pain to behold. One mural showed a great worm recoiling from its closest ally, its eyes wide with the absolute conviction that the friend it had known for centuries was now a monstrous impostor. Another depicted a council meeting descending into chaos as respected elders began shrieking accusations based on delusions only they could see, their fire sparking uncontrollably in the enclosed space. The most devastating image covered the entire far wall. It showed the heart of the dragon forces at the siege's climax, but they were not united against an external enemy. They were turned inward, locked in a vicious, fratricidal battle. Brothers scorched each other's wings. Mothers drove their own offspring into cascades of volcanic rock. And weaving through it all, unseen by the combatants but starkly visible on the mural, was the source, a complex, hauntingly beautiful pattern of interwoven light and sound, a visual representation of a song. It was a melody given form, and its sole purpose was to twist perception and amplify every latent, hidden fear into an overwhelming, undeniable reality. Elara stood transfixed, one hand pressed to her mouth. Her scholar's mind raced, categorizing, comparing, connecting fragments of lore she had once dismissed as myth. It wasn't a weapon of force, she breathed, her voice a hushed awe in the silent chamber. It was a weapon of the mind. This is mind weaving. I thought it was just a story, a metaphor for the chaos of war. She stepped closer to the wall, her fingers hovering just above the depiction of the shimmering song. The texts described it as the most insidious of the dark arts. It doesn't command, it doesn't control directly. It finds the deepest, most secret fear buried in a mind. The fear of betrayal, of inadequacy, of being truly alone. And it doesn't just bring it to the surface. It nurtures it. It convinces the mind that this fear is not a possibility, but an absolute, discovered truth. The victim's own psyche becomes the prison. The enemy merely provides the key. Her eyes widened as the full, terrifying implication crashed down upon her. She turned to Ancalagon, her face pale in the mural's ghostly light. The crystal, this is what they are trying to replicate. They're not just gathering fear energy to power some crude weapon. They're refining it. They're using my star melodies not to purify it, but to tune it. To shape that raw, chaotic terror into a specific, targeted frequency. She pointed a trembling finger at the intricate pattern on the wall. They are trying to weave a new song. But they don't have the original score. They're using the crystal as a resonator, and the residual energy in this mountain as their raw material. They're experimenting, trying to find the right frequency to do exactly this again. The thought was so abhorrent, it stole the air from her lungs. They're not just trying to conquer. They're trying to restart a plague of the mind that tore the most powerful beings in the world apart from the inside. And with the power they've harvested, with the heart fear concentrated in that crystal, They won't just be able to affect a few dragons on a battlefield. They could weave this song into the very ley lines of the world. They could make entire kingdoms turn on themselves. Ancalagon stared at the mural of brother turning on brother, and the ancient, calcified grief in his heart cracked open anew. This was the truth that had been hidden. This was the shame his race had buried deep within the mountain, a testament to their greatest vulnerability. They had not been defeated by a stronger force. They had been unraveled by a whispered lie they were made to believe was their own thought. The cult did not seek to create an army. They sought to create a pandemic of paranoia, a world where no one could trust their own mind, where every ally could be an enemy invented by fear. The scale of the ambition was beyond monstrous. It was a desecration of consciousness itself. Elara's voice was barely a whisper, thick with a dread that was now far more personal than academic. There close, the resonance we felt, the precision of the energy gathering, they're not just playing with power, they're conducting an orchestra. And I fear the overture is almost over. The hidden chamber was no longer a relic. It was a blueprint for a coming nightmare, and they were the only ones who had seen it. The narrow passageway ended abruptly at a jagged ledge, overlooking a sight that stole the breath from Elara's lungs and drew a low, dangerous rumble from deep within Ancalagon's chest. Below them stretched a cavern so immense its ceiling was lost in a haze of volcanic fumes and shifting shadows. The air itself thrummed with a palpable, oppressive energy, a dissonant chord that vibrated through the stone beneath their feet and set their very teeth on edge. At the cavern's heart, the cultists moved in a slow, precise circle, their ash-colored robes swirling around them as they chanted. Their voices were not unified in a holy hymn, but were a distorted, multi-layered cacophony, a guttural language of command layered over a higher, frantic whispering that sounded like 1,000 terrified voices pleading at once. In the center of their circle, suspended in the air above a complex pattern, carved into the floor and glowing with the same vicious purple-black energy that ran through the cultists' tattoos, was the crystal. But it was no longer the pulsing vessel Elara had nurtured. It was a miniature sun of concentrated nightmare. It blazed with a light that was painful to look upon, swirling within it shifting hues of deep crimson, sickly green, and the absolute black of a starless midnight. With every revolting syllable of the chant, the crystal pulsed, and a wave of pure, undiluted dread washed outward, so potent that Elara had to clutch the rock ledge to steady herself against a sudden, vertiginous urge to flee, to hide, to abandon all hope. And before this awful spectacle, the focus of the entire ritual, stood the reason for it all. It was a construct of iron and darkened steel, a monstrous parody of a dragon's form. It was larger than Ancalagon, a behemoth of interlocking plates, riveted joints, and cruel, angular lines. It stood utterly dormant, a colossus of silent, waiting menace, its head bowed and its wings folded tightly against its body. It had no life, no breath, no fire of its own, only a terrifying potential, an emptiness waiting to be filled. Channels and grooves were carved across its entire surface, all leading to a hollow cavity in its chest, a gaping maw designed for a very specific heart. The cult leader raised his tattooed hands, and the chanting rose to a fevered pitch. The crystal flared brighter than ever, and a thick, viscous beam of the captured fear energy, a rope of solidified anguish, lanced out from its core and slammed into the cavity in the construct's chest. The iron beast shuddered violently, the sound of grinding metal echoing through the cavern like the shriek of a dying world. The dark channels along its body began to glow, filling with the poisonous light, tracing the outline of the monstrous form like a diagram of nerves being awakened by lightning. This was no mere weapon of war. This was something far more insidious. It was not built to break walls or burn cities. It was designed to break spirits. It was a puppet, an empty vessel waiting for a terrible consciousness to inhabit it. The cult was not forging a blade. They were creating a conductor, a focal point from which their woven song of fear could be broadcast. This iron dragon would be their instrument, a walking, flying engine of despair that would not conquer through force, but through the absolute annihilation of hope, turning the courage of armies into ash and the resolve of nations into dust. They were giving a physical form to the most primal terror of a lost age, and they were moments away from giving it a voice. Ancalagon's immense body, coiled in the shadows of the Overlook, was a living conflict of instincts. The warrior in him screamed to descend in a cataclysm of flame and fury, to scatter the chanting cultists and shatter their abomination into scrap before it could draw another breath. But the ancient wisdom that came with his countless years saw the terrible flaw in that plan. The energy swirling within that crystal was not a tame fire to be extinguished. It was a barely contained star of pure anguish. A violent impact, a stray blast of his own fire, could destabilize it entirely. The resulting explosion would not merely be physical. It would be a psychic detonation, a wave of raw, unfiltered terror, so powerful, it would likely shatter his own mind and Elara's instantly, and perhaps even petrify the consciousness of every living thing within the mountain, leaving them as empty, screaming husks. He could not attack the weapon. He had to disrupt the hands that were aiming it. His voice, when it came, was the barest whisper of air, a vibration she felt more than heard. They are a single instrument. The chant is their breath, their focus. Break the rhythm, and the harmony fractures. Elara, her face pale, but her eyes sharp with a frantic intensity, gave a tight nod. She understood music, the power of resonance. The cult's song was a thing of darkness and domination, a forced unison that demanded perfect control. I can try to introduce a dissonance," she whispered back, her fingers already moving as if plucking invisible strings in the air. A counter-song from the celestial harmonies, the music of the spheres. It is order to their chaos, but it is subtle. It will take time to unravel their weave. They will not even notice it at first. Then they will need another distraction. Ancalagon rumbled, his golden eyes scanning the cavern's architecture with a new, calculating purpose. He was not looking at the cultists or their machine. He was reading the room itself, the stress points in the cavern's ceiling, the massive, unstable-looking stalactites hanging like stone daggers above the ritual circle, the fissures webbing the walls from ages of volcanic unrest. This was his mountain. He knew its bones, its weaknesses. A direct assault on the enemy was impossible, but an assault on the very stage of their performance, that was a different kind of warfare. When you begin your song, do not hold back. Pour all of your will into it. I will give them a reason to look away from you. He did not wait for her agreement. There was no time. With a powerful, silent push of his colossal legs, he launched himself from the ledge, not down into the open cavern, but upward, driving his claws into the cavern wall and climbing with shocking speed and silence for a creature of his size. He moved along the ceiling, a vast shadow against the greater darkness, his focus entirely on a specific, heavily fractured section of rock, from which two particularly massive stone spikes hung precariously. Below, Elara closed her eyes, drawing a deep, steadying breath. She pushed her own terror down, away from her heart and into a quiet corner of her mind, and reached for a different memory. The cold, clean silence of the void between stars, the precise, unwavering mathematics of their movements, the ancient, harmonious song they sang as they danced through eternity. She began to hum, so softly it was inaudible over the cult's chant, but the crystal at her wrist began to glow with a soft, silvery light. Ancalagon reached his chosen point. He anchored his powerful hind legs and drove his shoulders into the weakened section of the ceiling. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, groaning shudder that vibrated through the entire cavern, a network of cracks exploded across the rock. A hail of smaller stones and dust rained down first, peppering the ritual circle and causing several cultists to flinch, their chanting faltering for a split second. Then, with a sound like the mountain itself roaring in protest, one of the gigantic stalactites broke free. It tore loose from the ceiling and plummeted downward, a missile of solid stone, the size of an ancient tower, crashing into the ground just outside the carved ritual pattern. The impact was colossal, sending a shock wave through the floor that threw the cultists from their feet and shattered their precise formation. The cavern filled with the deafening roar of collapsing stone and the choking clouds of pulverized rock. In that moment of perfect chaos, as the cultists scrambled and their leader shouted orders to regain control, Elara's soft hum became a clear, piercing note. It cut through the din not with volume, but with purity, a single perfect tone that seemed to vibrate at a frequency that cleansed the air. It was the first note of her counter-song, a melody that spoke of balance, of order, of the calm, inevitable turn of the galaxy. She wove it into the discordant aftermath of the cave-in, a silver thread of harmony in a tapestry of noise. The effect was immediate, though subtle. The glowing ritual pattern on the floor flickered. The beam of energy connecting the crystal to the iron construct wavered, its intensity dimming for a crucial moment. The cult leader's head snapped up, not toward the falling rocks, but toward the source of this new, alien resonance, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and dawning rage. The diversion had worked, the rhythm was broken, and now the real battle had begun. Not a clash of force, but a duel of songs, one seeking to dominate the world with fear, the other fighting to remind it of the music of the stars. The cavern erupted into a symphony of chaos. The deafening roar of shattering stone filled the air as massive chunks of the ceiling rained down, crashing into the ritual circle and sending the cultists scrambling for cover. The perfect, unholy harmony of their chant fractured into a cacophony of panicked shouts and guttural curses. The beam of fear energy connecting the crystal to the construct flickered wildly, its intensity dimming as the cult leader fought to maintain his concentration amidst the falling debris. In that single, precious moment of disarray, a shadow detached itself from the ceiling. Ancalagon dropped like a meteor, his immense form a blur of scale and motion. His great claws, each one the size of a broadsword, closed around the blazing crystal, snatching it from the air. The sensation was instant and agonizing, a psychic shockwave of pure, concentrated terror that shot up his arm and threatened to overwhelm his ancient mind. He could feel the screams of 1,000 dragons, the heat of 1,000 betrayals, the cold vacuum of 1,000 despairs, all compressed into a single, searing point of anguish. But he held on, his will a fortress against the torrent, and he twisted in mid-air to make his escape. The cult leader, enraged beyond reason, screamed a single word of power that cut through the din like a knife. It was not a word of defense or retrieval. It was a word of ignition. He abandoned the ritual's delicate weaving and chose a cruder, more immediate solution. The intricate patterns carved into the iron construct's chest flared with a violent, blood-red light. The machine, which had been a dormant sculpture of cold metal, gave a convulsive, shuddering jolt. Its entire frame groaned and screeched as pistons fired for the first time in ages, and interlocking plates ground against one another. Its head, which had been bowed, snapped upward with a sound of shearing metal. Where its eyes should have been, two pools of swirling, crimson energy ignited, burning with a malevolent intelligence that was both ancient and utterly new. Then it shrieked. The sound was an abomination. It was not the roar of a living dragon, full of fire and life and fury. It was a perfect, horrifying mimicry of a dragon's cry of absolute despair, the kind of sound that was only ever made once in a lifetime, at the moment of ultimate defeat or betrayal. It was a sound ripped from the deepest, most guarded vaults of dragon memory, amplified and broadcast through a metallic throat. The wave of psychic force that accompanied the shriek hit Ancalagon like a physical blow. The memories he had just been fighting to suppress, the carvings of kin, turning on kin, the phantom flames of the siege, flooded back with unbearable clarity, not as history, but as a present and terrifying reality. For a crucial second, his grip on the present faltered, his wings stuttering in their beat. He was no longer a warrior in a cavern. He was a young dragon, watching his world burn, feeling the bonds of trust and loyalty snap one by one. The iron monster was not just a weapon, it was a key, and it had just unlocked the darkest door in his soul. The iron beast's head swiveled with a grinding of metal on metal, its burning crimson eyes fixing on the dragon who held its stolen heart. Its maw, a jagged opening of darkened steel, did not roar fire. Instead, it hummed with a building, nauseating energy, and from its depths, a beam of pure blackness shot forth, laced with flickering threads of violent purple and red. It was not a weapon of heat or force. It was a spear of solidified nightmare. Ancalagon, still clutching the agonizing crystal, tried to bank away, but the beam was not aimed at his body. It was aimed at his spirit. It struck him not on his scales, but in his mind. The cavern, the cultists, Elara's desperate song. It all vanished. He was thrown backward through time, not as an observer, but as a participant reliving a moment etched into his soul with acid and fire. He was no longer a centuries-old survivor. He was a young dragon, strong and fierce, fighting alongside his winged brother, Glorung. The sky was choked with smoke and the screams of the dying. Below, the forces of the Dark Lord clashed with the armies of light. The air thrummed with the heat of their own breath and the whistle of elven arrows. He saw Glorung, magnificent and terrible, turning to him with a familiar flash of camaraderie in his eyes, a shared glance that spoke of victory to come. And then he saw the change, a flicker of something alien and cold in Glorung's gaze, a subtle shift in the angle of his wing. The world seemed to slow. He saw Glorung's chest swell, not with a jet of flame aimed at the enemy below, but with a focused, searing blast directed squarely at him. The heat was unimaginable, the pain, a white-hot brand of shock and betrayal that seared deeper than any physical wound. The trust they had built over decades, the unspoken bond of kin, shattered in an instant, replaced by the horrifying, incomprehensible truth that his brother had turned against him. The memory was so vivid, so visceral, that Ancalagon's physical form in the present cavern recoiled as if struck, a roar of anguish and confusion tearing from his throat that was entirely of the past. The vision did not end. It multiplied, as the paralysis of the fear beam held him in its grip. A cascade of other memories flooded in, each one a fresh hell. He saw his mate, her scales shimmering like captured moonlight, falling from the sky, not from an enemy's spear, but caught in a crossfire of chaotic, panicked flame from their own kind. He saw a venerable elder, a dragon he had looked to for wisdom and guidance, his eyes wide with a paranoia so absolute that he lashed out at his own protectors, convinced they were impostors sent to assassinate him. He felt the crushing despair of watching the unbreakable unity of dragon-kind fracture and crumble, not from an external force, but from a sickness of the mind that turned loyalty into suspicion and love into venom. This was the true Siege of Thangorodrim, not a battle lost on a field, but a soul lost in a hall of mirrors where every reflection was a friend turned foe. Back in the cavern, the great dragon was frozen in midair, his wings locked, his body rigid. The crystal, still clutched in his claw, pulsed in time with his agony, feeding the construct's power with his own living nightmare. He was trapped in a perfect, inescapable loop of his own most devastating history. The iron machine, sensing its advantage, took a ground-shaking step forward, its metallic claws screeching against the stone. Its chest cavity glowed brighter, preparing another blast. This one aimed to finish what the first had started, to drown the last dragon so completely in the sorrows of the past that he would never find his way back to the present. The cult leader watched from the sidelines, a smile of vile triumph stretching across his features. His creation was working perfectly, the greatest strength of the dragons, their long, unbroken memory, had become, in this moment, their ultimate and most exploitable weakness. The scream of the iron construct was a physical thing, a wave of pressure that sought to crush his will and drown him in the past. Ancalagon was lost, his mind adrift in a sea of fire and betrayal, the agonizing memory of his brother's treachery, playing on an endless, searing loop. The world had shrunk to that single moment of shattering trust, and the weight of centuries of grief and isolation that followed threatened to pull him under forever. He was alone, as he had always been alone, and the fight was already lost. But then, another sound pierced the cacophony of his torment. It was thin, reedy, a voice utterly insignificant against the roar of memory and machine. Yet it was clear, and it was present. Ancalagon, look at me. It was Elara, her voice strained to its breaking point, shouting not in fear, but in furious command. The crystal, remember why we are here, remember our purpose. Her words were not a gentle plea. They were a lifeline thrown into a stormy sea, and something in his ancient, reeling consciousness seized it. Her voice was an anchor, a point of absolute reality in the shifting nightmare, It was not a voice from his past. It held no memory of the siege, no echo of dragon roars. It was entirely of the now, a human voice, fragile and determined, cutting through the illusion with the sharp, clean precision of a diamond-tipped needle. His focus, which had been turned entirely inward on his own pain, wrenched outward. For a single, crucial second, he was not the young dragon betrayed at the siege. He was Ancalagon the Last, in a cavern, holding a crystal of immense power, with an ally at his side, fighting a common enemy. He saw Elara, small and exposed, her hands raised not in defense, but in a continued effort to weave her counter-song, her face a mask of determination against the overwhelming dread pouring from the machine. She was still fighting. She had not abandoned their shared goal, even as he had fallen into the trap of his own history. And in that moment of clarity, a profound realization exploded in his mind, so obvious and yet so revolutionary, it was like a first breath of clean air after centuries in a tomb. The construct was not powered by some alien, incomprehensible magic. It was a mirror. It was a perfect reflection of the very thing that had destroyed his kind. It weaponized the exact same force that had turned dragon against dragon. Not raw power, but amplified, manipulated fear. It fed on isolation, on the belief that one was alone and surrounded by enemies. It thrived on the conviction that trust was a weakness and unity was an impossibility. The cult had not invented a new horror. They had simply found a way to bottle the old one and pour it into a shell of iron. His entire life, his entire understanding of strength, had been built upon a foundation of solitary might. The solution to any threat was greater fire, greater force, greater fury. But that was the thinking that had doomed his kin. To fight this enemy with force was to feed it. To meet its fear with rage was to give it exactly what it craved. The way to break the mirror was not to shatter it with a hammer, but to change what it reflected. The cult's entire strategy, their perfect weapon, was predicated on one unshakable assumption: that their victims would always inevitably turn inward and face their fears alone. They had never planned for someone to turn outward. They had never planned for a partnership. A new plan, fragile and born of desperation, formed in his mind. It was not a strategy of destruction, but one of connection. He could not overpower the fear. He had to transform it. He could not shatter the crystal. He had to harmonize with it. And he could not do it alone. His voice, when it came, was a raw scrape, but it was directed at Elara, a thread of sound woven through the machine's shrieking. Your song, do not fight its frequency. Match it, then lift it. He was asking her to perform the most dangerous act of musical alchemy imaginable, to not oppose the song of fear, but to first join it, to understand its terrible melody from the inside, and then, once in tune, to gently guide it towards something else. Towards something higher. He then turned his own focus inward, but not toward the memory of fear. He reached for a different, older memory, one he had buried even deeper. The memory of the unity that had existed before the siege, the feeling of a sky full of his kin, not as a military force, but as a family, the deep, resonant hum of 100 dragons humming in contentment under a star-filled sky. The shared warmth of a volcanic vent on a cold night, the unshakable trust of a wing brother flying in perfect formation, knowing the other would be there without a single word exchanged. These were not loud, dramatic memories. They were quiet, they were gentle, they were the absolute antithesis of the construct's screaming narrative. He began to channel his own immense fire, but he did not direct it as a weapon. He let it flow through him, not as a jet of destruction, but as a radiant, warm light, a beacon of that remembered unity, a physical manifestation of clarity and courage in the face of the oppressive dark. He was offering an alternative frequency, not through opposition, but through invitation. His words cut through the dissonance, a clear command that was also a profound act of trust. Elara, her own mind reeling from the psychic onslaught, did not hesitate. She closed her eyes, shutting out the terrifying spectacle of the shuddering iron beast and the chanting cultists. She turned her focus inward, reaching for the core of her star-born magic, for the pure, mathematical harmonies that govern the movement of celestial bodies. She had been trying to oppose the fear frequency, to block it with a wall of order, and it had been like trying to stop a tidal wave with her hands. Now, she changed her approach. Instead of building a wall, she extended a thread. She listened, not to the surface-level scream of the machine, but to the deep, underlying note of its terrible song. It was a note of absolute isolation, of trust shattered into a million pieces. It was the most sorrowful sound she had ever perceived. Finding that foundational note, she did not play against it. She matched it. Her voice, amplified by her will and her crystal, wove a single pure tone that was the exact harmonic twin of the construct's core frequency. For a moment, the two sounds merged, and the pressure in the room intensified. A dissonance so perfect, it was almost a new kind of silence. The cult leader's triumphant smile widened, believing his enemy had finally succumbed, and joined the chorus of despair. But he had misunderstood the strategy completely. Elara was not joining the song of fear, she was empathizing with it. By first matching its pitch, she established a connection, a bridge between her order and its chaos. Then, with immense delicacy, as if lifting a sleeping child, she began to very subtly shift her own tone. She introduced a slow, ascending variation, a gentle lift that spoke not of the end of things, but of a dawn after a long night. It was a melody of remembrance, of things lost but not forgotten, of sorrow that could, in time, become strength. As her counter-melody began its careful, uplifting climb, Ancalagon enacted his part of their unspoken pact. Deep within his chest, the volcanic fires that had for centuries been a weapon of incineration and rage began to bank and change. He did not gather the heat to expel it in a destructive jet. Instead, he let it suffuse his entire being, radiating outward from every scale, not as blistering heat, but as a warm, golden luminescence. This was not the fire of destruction. This was the light of a forge that mends, the glow of a hearth that welcomes, the unwavering beacon of a star that guides. He became a living sun in the cavern, his light pushing back the oppressive shadows, not by obliterating them, but by revealing them for what they were, shadows, and nothing more. His light was a physical manifestation of a truth he had just remembered, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the presence of a stronger light. The two energies, Elara's ascending star song and Ancalagon's radiant fire light, did not merely exist side by side. They began to weave together, her notes giving form and direction to his light, his illumination giving warmth and substance to her melody. They created a new resonance, a harmonic field that filled the cavern. It did not attack the fear frequency. It surrounded it, permeated it, and offered it a different choice. The dissonance was not shattered by force, but gently unraveled by a superior, more complex harmony. The effect on the iron construct was immediate and jarring. Its relentless advance faltered. The searing beam of black energy flickered and died in its throat. The machine began to shudder violently, its metallic joints screeching in protest, as if its very substance was rejecting the new reality being imposed upon it. The swirling crimson light in its eyes dimmed, sputtered, and for a single, breathtaking moment, flickered with a hint of the same golden light that now emanated from the last dragon. The cult's perfect weapon, built to exploit isolation, was utterly confounded by the one thing its creators had never factored into their calculations: the simple, undeniable power of a harmony forged in trust. The sight of their perfect creation, faltering under the gentle assault of harmony, was more than the cult leader could bear. A guttural scream of pure, undiluted fury ripped from his throat, a sound so raw it seemed to tear at the very fabric of the air. His triumph, so certain just moments before, was curdling into ashes before his eyes, undone not by a superior force, but by a concept so alien to his philosophy, it was an absolute abomination: cooperation. His tattoos, which had pulsed with the stolen energy of the crystal, now flared with a manic, violent light, as if his rage were igniting the very ink under his skin. Reason deserted him. Strategy was abandoned. All that remained was a desperate, scorching need to reclaim his victory by any means necessary, to force the world back into the shape of his terrible design. With a final, wordless shriek of defiance, he lunged, but not at Ancalagon, and not at Elara. He threw himself directly at the shuddering, disoriented construct. It should have been suicide, a fragile body of flesh and bone, hurling itself against a mountain of hardened iron and seething energy. But as he connected with the machine's chest plate, the dark symbols on his arms and across his torso blazed with an intensity that eclipsed the sun. The metal did not repel him, it flowed. It parted like a dark liquid, swallowing him whole, absorbing him into its core. The act was not one of mechanics, but of a horrifying, sacrificial magic, a final, irrevocable merging of man and machine, of fanatical will and destructive potential. For a moment, the construct was still. Then it began to change. The rigid, angular plates of its body rippled and shifted, reshaping themselves. The joints, once screeching and stiff, now moved with a new, terrible fluidity. The crimson light in its eyes reignited, but now it swirled with a new, malicious intelligence, a chilling consciousness that was both the cold logic of the machine and the burning hatred of the man. A voice boomed forth, but it was no longer a single voice. It was a layered chorus, the grinding of gears, the hiss of steam, and the cult leader's own fanatical tones, twisted and amplified into something monstrous and deep. You think your petty light can dispel the primordial dark? The hybrid monster roared, its new form taking a ground, shaking step forward. You think your little song can silence the symphony of fear that is the birthright of all living things? You have delayed nothing. You have only chosen the stage for my masterpiece. It raised a massive, clawed limb that now pulsed with veins of organic-looking energy amidst the iron. The dragons were the first chorus, a testament to the power of dread. But they were a flawed instrument, too independent, too proud. They broke under the strain of their own terror. But I have become the perfect vessel. Mind and machine, will and weapon, united in a single purpose. The creature's chest cavity, where the crystal still pulsed, glowed with a renewed, terrifying ferocity. This energy will not be contained. It will be unleashed. It will roll out from this mountain like a tide, and it will begin with the valleys below, teeming with their fragile, hopeful lives. They will not be conquered by armies. They will be conquered by themselves. They will look upon their loved ones and see betrayers. They will look upon their homes and see prisons. Their greatest strengths will become their most exquisite vulnerabilities. They will bow, not to me, but to the absolute truth of their own insignificance and terror, just as the mighty dragons once did. And from their broken spirits, a new world order will be forged, one where fear is the only king, and I am its sole and eternal voice. The hybrid beast's declaration hung in the air, a promise of absolute psychological desolation that made the very stone of the cavern feel brittle with dread. Ancalagon's every instinct, forged in a lifetime of combat, screamed at him to attack, to meet this abomination with the full, incinerating fury of his breath and the crushing power of his claws. But the memory of the murals was seared into his mind, the image of dragons turning on each other, their own immense power becoming the instrument of their downfall. To fight this enemy with raw force would be to play directly into its design. It was a creature born of and designed to thrive on conflict. To engage it was to feed it. The crystal at its core was a bomb of solidified anguish, and a violent impact would not disarm it. It would detonate it, unleashing a psychic shockwave that would petrify the consciousness of every living thing for leagues around. Containment was the only path, but the concept seemed a fantasy. How does one cage a nightmare? How does one bottle a scream? The energy was not a physical substance to be trapped in a box or buried under stone. It was a resonant frequency, an idea given terrible power. It would seep through any physical barrier, its corrosive melody finding purchase in any mind vulnerable to fear. The impossibility of the task was a weight threatening to crush his resolve. But then, from the deepest vaults of his ancestral memory, a whisper emerged not of fear, but of hope, a fragment of an older story, a legend from the time before the wars, when dragons were not just creatures of fire, but of forging. The elders spoke of a place within Thangorodrim, not shaped by claw or tool, but by the mountain's own fiery heart. They called it the Ether Forge, or the Forge of Memories. It was said to be a natural chamber where the boundaries between the physical and the emotional were uniquely thin, where the heat of the world's core interacted with rare crystalline formations to create a resonant field. In this place, the legends said, dragon fire, not the destructive jet used in war, but the focused, creative breath of a master smith, could act as a catalyst. It could not destroy strong emotion, but it could temper it. It could take a raw, screaming frequency of pure terror, and through a process akin to spiritual smithing, anneal it, overloading its intensity until it fractured into a million harmless, echoing fragments, still a memory of the pain, but stripped of its power to harm, like a storm seen from a great distance. It was a desperate gamble, 1,000 to 1 chance, based on a nursery tale, but it was the only chance they had. The plan formed in his mind with the clarity of desperation. He could not destroy the beast here. He had to move it, He had to lure this engine of fear to the one place in the mountain where its very essence could be transformed. It was a predator's strategy turned inside out. He was not leading prey to a lair to be consumed, but leading a poison to its own antidote. He locked his gaze with the monstrous hybrid, its eyes swirling with the mad intelligence of the cult leader, now fused with the cold logic of the machine. There would be no subtle trickery here, no feint it would not see. Its entire being was now attuned to fear and dominance. The only bait it would willingly follow was the promise of his own complete and utter submission. He would have to offer it a chase. He would have to let it believe it was driving him to ground, that its victory was inevitable. He would have to make it hungry. With a roar that was not of challenge, but of apparent frustration and retreat, Ancalagon turned from the hybrid beast. It was not a full flight escape. That would have been too obvious a surrender. It was a strategic withdrawal, a calculated show of weakness. He beat his powerful wings, not to soar, but to scramble backward, away from the creature, his body language conveying a sense of being overwhelmed, of seeking a more defensible position. He was an ancient actor, playing the most dangerous role of his long life, and his stage was the treacherous, volcanic heart of his own home. His path was not random. He pushed through a narrow archway leading out of the main cavern, choosing a route that descended sharply, a path of tight turns and unstable footing that would force the massive construct to work, to fight for every yard it gained, stoking its fury and its certainty that its prey was cornered. The chase was on. The last dragon was leading the embodiment of his species' greatest failure on a desperate pilgrimage to the one place that might offer not a victory, but a healing. The chase became a desperate, high-speed dance through the mountain's exposed arteries. Ancalagon surged forward, his immense body a study in controlled velocity, as he navigated the treacherous, glass-smooth tunnels formed by ancient lava flows. Elara clung to a ridge on his back, her knuckles white, her world reduced to a blur of shimmering obsidian walls and the deafening roar of their pursuit. Behind them, the hybrid monstrosity was not merely following, it was demolishing the path in its wake. Its metallic claws tore great gouges in the fragile volcanic rock, and its deafening screams of rage and threat were a constant psychological assault, promising an end far more terrible than a simple fall into magma. The very mountain seemed to groan in protest at this violation of its deepest sanctuaries. Ancalagon's every sense was stretched to its limit. His eyes, adapted to the gloom of the deep earth, scanned ahead for the subtle shifts in air current that signaled a branching path or a dead end. His hearing, attuned to the subtlest vibrations of the rock, tracked the relentless, grinding advance of the beast behind them. But most crucial was his intimate, born knowledge of Thangorodrim's volatile anatomy. He was not running blindly. He was navigating a living, breathing, and deeply unstable organism. He could feel the heat building through the stone beneath his claws, a sign they were descending into regions where the barrier between the solid rock and the liquid fire of the world's heart was perilously thin. One misjudged turn, one ill-considered blast of his own fire to clear an obstruction, could trigger a chain reaction, a volcanic vent bursting open beneath them, or an entire section of the tunnel network collapsing under the strain, burying them all in a tomb of superheated stone. The path narrowed further, forcing Ancalagon to tuck his wings tightly, his scales scraping against the narrowing walls with a sound that set Elara's teeth on edge. They erupted onto a breathtakingly fragile-looking bridge of natural rock that arced across a vast, subterranean chasm. Far below, a river of molten magma glowed with a sullen, orange light, its heat rising in visible waves that distorted the air. The bridge was a ribbon of stone, no wider than Ancalagon was long, and its surface was webbed with hairline fractures that glittered in the hellish glow from below. He did not hesitate, launching onto it with a powerful thrust of his legs, his weight making the entire structure shudder and groan ominously. He was halfway across when the hybrid beast reached the other side. The creature did not slow. It slammed onto the bridge with the force of a landslide. A web of cracks exploded across the stone span, with a sound like 1,000 windows shattering at once. Chunks of rock calved away from the edges, tumbling silently into the magma river far below. The bridge began to sag in the middle, a slow, terrifying droop toward the inferno. Ancalagon pushed forward, his powerful muscles driving him the last few yards to the relative safety of the solid ledge on the far side. He skidded to a halt, turning just in time to see the hybrid, undeterred by the collapsing world beneath it, continue its relentless charge. Its massive weight was the final straw. With a great, shuddering crack that echoed through the entire chasm, the center of the bridge gave way. The hybrid beast roared, not in fear, but in furious indignation, as it plummeted downward with several tons of shattered stone. For a single, heart-stopping moment, Ancalagon and Elara stared into the abyss, the only sound the hiss of falling rock meeting liquid fire. Had the mountain itself taken their side? But then, a searing beam of black energy lanced up from the depths, striking the ceiling above them and showering them with debris. A grinding, screeching sound followed, and slowly, impossibly, the iron beast began to haul itself up the sheer chasm wall, its metal claws finding purchase in the rock, its eyes burning with a hatred that seemed to defy physics itself. It had not been stopped. It had only been made angrier. The chase was not over. It was entering its final, most dangerous phase, deep in the sacred, volatile heart of the mountain, where every step was a gamble with annihilation. The narrow lava tube finally opened into a vast, breathtaking space that felt less like a cavern and more like the heart of a star. This was the Aether Forge. The air itself shimmered with a tangible energy, thick and heavy, tasting of ozone and ancient stone. The chamber was a natural amphitheater, its curved walls studded with massive, multifaceted crystals that glowed with a soft, internal light, pulsing in a slow, deep rhythm, as if in tune with the mountain's own heartbeat. Across the floor, dozens of volcanic vents hissed, releasing plumes of superheated steam that rose in shimmering curtains, each one acting as a conduit, amplifying and clarifying the emotional resonance that saturated the air. This was not a place built by claw or tool. It was a sacred convergence of geology and magic, a crucible where raw feeling could be given form and substance. Ancalagon surged into the center of this immense space, his powerful wings beating once to slow his momentum before his massive claws met the smooth, warm stone of the forge's heart. The transition from the frantic, terrifying chase to the profound stillness of the chamber was jarring. The hybrid beast's enraged screams still echoed from the tunnel behind them, but here, in the forge, the sound seemed to dampen, its malevolence absorbed and diffused by the resonant crystals. Elara slid from his back, her legs trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming pressure of the atmosphere. It was like standing inside a living, breathing emotion. The great dragon did not prepare for a final, desperate battle. Instead, he drew himself up to his full, majestic height, his scales reflecting the myriad colors of the glowing crystals. He closed his eyes, not in retreat, but in profound focus. Then he began to chant. It was not a roar of challenge or a cry of fury. It was something far older, far more powerful. The sound that emerged from his chest was a deep, complex vibration, a melody woven from memory and will. He was not calling upon the memory of the siege's terror, the betrayal, or the pain that the cult's machine thrived upon. He was reaching for something else entirely, something buried beneath the layers of anguish. His chant was a summoning of honor. It was a song of the great worms who had soared these skies, not as instruments of war, but as guardians of the high places, their wisdom as deep as the mountain roots. It was a lament for the fallen, not with the sharp sting of loss, but with the soft, enduring weight of respect. He sang of acceptance of the past with all its complexity, acceptance of the failure and the glory, acceptance that the story of his kind contained both light and shadow, and that to deny one was to diminish the other. He was not fighting the fear, he was offering it a different story to tell. He was filling the forge's amplifier, not with a frequency of resistance, but with a frequency of wholeness, inviting the very essence of the mountain to remember the dragons not as broken victims of a song, but as complete beings whose legacy was far greater than their final, sorrowful hour. The crystals around the chamber began to pulse in time with his chant, their light growing warmer, brighter, weaving his offering into the very fabric of the space, preparing the crucible for what was to come. The iron monstrosity erupted into the forge with the force of a landslide, its arrival shattering the chamber's sacred stillness. Its form, a grotesque fusion of fanatical man and cold machine, seemed to warp the very air around it, a blight upon the harmonious resonance of the space. Its burning crimson eyes fixed on Ancalagon, and without hesitation, it unleashed its primary weapon, a searing beam of absolute blackness, shot through with violent purple energy, lanced across the chamber. This was not a weapon of heat or kinetic force. It was a concentrated spear of psychic dread, designed to paralyze the mind with visions of its own deepest terrors. But something remarkable happened as the beam struck the space between the beast and the dragon. It did not travel unimpeded. The thick, ozone-rich air of the forge seemed to act as a buffer, causing the dark energy to diffuse and spread out, its malevolent focus dissolving before it could reach its target. The intricate crystalline formations studding the walls flared with a soft, opalescent light, absorbing the scattered frequencies of fear and transmuting them into harmless, shimmering patterns of light that danced across their facets. The hybrid beast recoiled, its grinding shriek echoing with a note of confusion. Its greatest power, the weapon engineered to exploit the vulnerabilities of the mind, was being neutralized by the environment itself. The forge was not resisting the fear, it was digesting it, rendering its poison inert through a natural alchemy the cult could never have comprehended. Ancalagon did not seize this moment to counterattack with his own physical might. He understood that to meet its violence with violence would be to descend to its level, to feed the very cycle of conflict the beast embodied. Instead, he planted his massive claws firmly upon the warm stone of the forge's heart, and tapped into a fire far older and more profound than the destructive blaze he had wielded in battle. He closed his eyes, drawing upon the deepest wellspring of his being, and began to channel his inner fire, not outward as a weapon, but downward into the living rock beneath him. This was not the fire of incineration. It was the fire of creation, of life, of pure, unadulterated energy. It was the essence of what his kind had been before fear had twisted them, a power of warmth and light and growth. As his fiery energy poured into the ground, the forge responded as if greeting an old friend. The volcanic vents dotting the chamber hissed louder, their plumes of steam rising in thicker, more vibrant curtains that began to pulse with a gentle, golden light. The massive crystals embedded in the walls and ceiling hummed in sympathetic vibration, their soft internal glows intensifying, shifting from a passive opalescence to an active, brilliant luminescence. The very stone beneath Ancalagon's feet began to glow, intricate networks of light spreading out from his claws like luminous roots, connecting him to the heart of the mountain. A new sound filled the chamber, rising above the beast's enraged grinding, a deep, harmonious frequency that felt less like something heard and more like something felt in the soul. It was a resonant tone of profound peace, of ancient stability, of a courage that is not the absence of fear, but the presence of something stronger. It was the mountain's own song, and Ancalagon had just given it a voice. The oppressive, terror-soaked atmosphere pushed into the chamber by the hybrid beast began to recede, replaced by this growing wave of soothing, harmonious energy that promised not victory, but healing. Elara's voice, thin and reedy against the monolithic presence of the forge, found its anchor in the dragon's foundational chant. She did not try to overpower his deep, resonant frequency. Instead, she wove her star-born melody around it, a silver thread of celestial mathematics, intertwining with a golden cord of ancestral memory. Her song was one of precise, unwavering order, the harmonic constant that governed the turning of galaxies, the patient, inevitable pull of gravity, the silent, beautiful logic of a universe in perfect balance. It was the absolute opposite of the chaotic, screeching dissonance the hybrid beast embodied. Together, their voices created something entirely new, a dual harmony that was both a shield and a solvent, a resonant field of such profound stability that it began to gently, inexorably envelop the monstrosity. The hybrid beast, sensing this new energy, redoubled its efforts. It shrieked, and another beam of black fear energy lanced out, but this time, the effect was dramatically different. The beam did not diffuse or scatter against the harmonious field. It was absorbed by it. The dark energy flowed into the confluence of dragon roar and star song like a toxic stream, joining a clean, mighty river. Its poison diluted and transformed by the sheer volume and purity of the harmonious flow. The creature took a shuddering step backward, its movements becoming jerky and uncoordinated, as if the very will that drove it was being unraveled from within. The malevolent crimson light in its eyes flickered wildly, dimming and then flaring as the consciousness at its core fought a desperate, losing battle against the cleansing tide. Inside the iron shell, the cult leader experienced the transformation not as a defeat, but as a horrifying, beautiful awakening. The purified energy flowing into the machine did not attack him, it surrounded him. It was a light that revealed, not a fire that burned, For the first time since he had given himself to the dark path, the addictive song of absolute power that had filled his mind was silenced. In its place was a profound, echoing quiet, and in that quiet, he was forced to see himself. He saw the long chain of choices that had led him here, the pride, the hunger for control, the willingness to see other beings as instruments for his ambition. He saw the faces of those he had manipulated, including Elara's, not as pawns on a board, but as people with hopes and fears of their own. The fear energy he had so coveted and weaponized was still within him, but its nature was changed. It was no longer a weapon to be wielded against others. It was his own fear reflected back at him, the terror of his own insignificance, the dread of his own mortality, the raw, naked horror of what he had become. But without the dark magic to twist it into a source of power, it was simply pain, human pain. Remorse, sharp and undeniable, flooded the space where fanatical certainty had once resided. A scream tore from his throat, but it was not a scream of rage or defiance. It was a raw, agonized cry of realization and regret, the sound of a soul waking from a long and terrible dream to find its hands stained. This internal cataclysm proved too much for the delicate, perverse magic binding man to machine. The iron shell, designed to contain and amplify a specific, corrupted frequency, could not withstand the pure, chaotic humanity now bursting from its core. With a sound like a mountain cracking in two, a web of brilliant white light exploded across the construct's chest plate. The metal did not bend or melt. It petrified and then shattered, exploding outward in a shower of harmless, crystalline dust that glittered like ice in the forge's warm light. From within the dissolving prison, the cult leader tumbled onto the smooth stone floor, his body whole and unharmed, but his spirit utterly laid bare. He curled into himself, weeping uncontrollably, his grand designs replaced by the overwhelming, simple weight of what he had done. The tattoos on his arms were gone, faded away as if they had never been, and the crystal that clattered to the ground beside him was no longer a blazing star of nightmare. Its light was dimmed to a soft, gentle pulse, a quiet, rhythmic glow like a sleeping heart, all its destructive potential safely neutralized, its captured anguish finally soothed into a peaceful, dormant state. With the cult leader's hollow form, curled and weeping on the warm stone, the immediate, screaming threat had passed, but the source of its power still pulsed with a dangerous, unstable light. The crystal lay where it had fallen, its surface swirling with the captured anguish of an entire race, a condensed nightmare waiting for a careless touch to reignite its terrible potential. Ancalagon approached it not with trepidation, but with a profound, weary reverence. This was not an object to be destroyed in anger or discarded in haste. It was a wound that required delicate, final stitching. His massive head lowered, his golden eyes reflecting the crystal's chaotic dance of crimson and black, and with a gentleness that belied his immense size, he extended a single, clawed forelimb. He did not grasp it, he cradled it, as one might hold a dying ember that still held the memory of a great and terrible fire. He turned from the broken man and the shattered remains of the iron construct, his movements slow and deliberate, carrying his fragile burden toward the very center of the Aether Forge. Here, the air hummed with the residual harmony of their combined song, and the volcanic vents hissed with a steady, rhythmic breath. The heart of the forge was not a fiery pit, but a natural basin of seamless, glassy obsidian, fed by a dozen tiny rivulets of liquid fire that trickled from the surrounding rock, meeting in a pool of shimmering, molten light. This was not a fire that consumed. It was a fire that purified, that tempered, its heat a gentle, constant presence that had burned since the mountain's first breath. With the care of a parent laying a child to rest, Ancalagon bent his great neck and placed the crystal into the center of this living basin. For a moment, nothing happened. The crystal simply sat there, its dark energy seeming to repel the gentle, golden light of the forge. Then, the mountain itself seemed to lean in. The trickling streams of lava shifted their course almost imperceptibly, winding around the crystal, not attacking it, but encircling it in a slow, deliberate embrace. The gentle heat began its work. There was no violent explosion, no dramatic dissolution. Instead, the crystal's violent, swirling colors began to soften at the edges, the sharp contrasts blurring as if viewed through a heat haze. The searing crimson bled into a soft orange, the absolute black softened to a deep, twilight gray. It was a process of alchemy, not annihilation. The harmful energy, the concentrated essence of primal terror, did not vanish into nothingness. It was slowly, patiently unraveled by the forge's unique properties. The volcanic heat acted as a catalyst, breaking the intense, compressed frequency of fear into its component parts, separating the raw emotional energy from the malicious intent that had been woven into it. The energy itself, now neutralized and harmless, was absorbed by the glowing crystals studding the chamber walls, which pulsed with a soft, accepting light, storing it not as a weapon, but as a quiet, historical record, a memory stripped of its power to harm. The malicious intent, the dark will of the cult, simply dissipated, like a foul odor carried away on a fresh, clean wind, unable to maintain its form in the face of such overwhelming harmony. As the process completed, the last of the crystal's ominous light, fading into a dull, inert gray, before the stone itself gently cracked and crumbled into a fine, ashen powder that was swept away by the steam vents. A profound change swept through the mountain. The constant, subconscious pressure that had weighed upon every stone and every chamber for centuries, the psychic scar tissue of the ancient siege, simply lifted. It was as if a great, held breath was finally, softly exhaled. The very air felt lighter, easier to breathe. The faint, whispering echoes of long-dead fears that had haunted the deeper tunnels, the subtle chill that had lingered in shadowed corners, simply faded, not into silence, but into a peaceful, distant memory, like the echo of a storm that has long since passed over the horizon. The silence that remained was not the silence of a tomb, but the silence of a deep and healing sleep. Thangorodrim, for the first time in an age, was finally at peace, its oldest wound cleansed and closed, not by forgetting the past, but by finally understanding it. The silence that settled over the Aether Forge was profound, but it was no longer the heavy, watchful quiet of a tomb. It was the deep, clean stillness that follows a great storm, the air itself feeling washed and new. The oppressive psychic weight that had saturated the mountain for centuries had dissipated, leaving behind only the gentle hum of the geothermal vents and the soft, rhythmic pulsing of the chamber's crystals. In the center of this vast, peaceful space, the two architects of this change stood facing one another, the colossal ancient worm and the small, determined human, separated by millennia of history and experience, yet bound now by a shared trial that had rewritten both their destinies. Ancalagon was the first to break the stillness, his voice a low, resonant rumble that held none of its former thunderous judgment, but rather a tone of weary, hard-won clarity. Your purpose was not born from a desire for conquest or personal gain, he stated, the words not a question, but a solemn acknowledgement. I can see the truth of it in the echoes you leave upon the air. You sought to mend a broken world, to use a terrible power as a suture for a wound you believed was bleeding into the future. That is a courage I have not witnessed in your kind for an age. He paused, his great head tilting slightly, the golden light of his eyes softening. But the road to despair is very often paved with the stones of good intentions, laid by those who believed their vision was the only true path. You saw the power sleeping here as a tool, a resource to be harnessed and redirected. You did not understand that some forces are not tools to be wielded, but living currents to be respected. To attempt to channel them is to invite the current to change you, and rarely for the better. Elara did not drop her gaze, though the weight of his words and the truth they carried made her want to shrink away. She looked at the place where the crystal had dissolved, then at her own hands, which had so confidently sought to manipulate energies she could only intellectually comprehend. I thought my knowledge was a shield, she said, her voice quiet but steady, devoid of its former scholarly certainty. I had deciphered the star charts, translated the dead languages, pieced together the rituals from fragments older than recorded history. I believed understanding was the same as mastery. I was arrogant. She finally looked up, meeting the dragon's gaze, her expression one of raw, unguarded remorse. I saw the potential for salvation in that energy. I never truly saw the centuries of pain and loss that were its foundation. I thought I could heal a scar without understanding the depth of the wound that made it. I underestimated not just the power, but the profound responsibility that comes from touching something so intimately tied to the soul of a people. I became the key in the hands of the very darkness I sought to thwart. This mutual admission hung between them, not as a point of conflict, but as a foundation. There was no blame, for both had been deceived in their own ways, he by the isolation of his long vigil, she by the seductive clarity of her academic certainty. They had each been playing a solo part in a symphony they hadn't realized was being conducted by a hidden, malevolent hand. In the crushing quiet after the battle, with the cult leader's broken sobs the only reminder of the catastrophe they had narrowly averted, they both understood that their greatest failure had been a failure of perspective. Ancalagon had seen only a reckless intruder. Elara had seen only a legendary guardian hoarding a dangerous relic. Neither had considered that the other might hold a piece of the puzzle, that the solution would not be found in solitary strength or solitary knowledge, but in the difficult, messy, and terrifying act of trust. The mountain's peace had not been won by a dragon's fire or a human song alone, but by the fragile, powerful harmony they had created together. The decision to seal the mountain's heart was not made in fear, but in profound respect for the delicate balance between memory and madness. Ancalagon's massive head gestured toward the now quiet forge, its crystals pulsing with a soft, steady light. Some truths are too potent to be left in the open, he rumbled, his voice a low vibration that felt like the mountain itself speaking. They are not secrets to be hoarded, but lessons that must be earned. To leave these chambers unguarded would be to invite another wave of seekers, some with pure hearts, others with hungry ones, all drawn by the siren call of a power they cannot possibly understand. The scar must be allowed to heal, not picked at for eternity. Elara nodded, her earlier fervor replaced by a somber understanding. She had been one of those seekers, her intentions noble, but her understanding dangerously incomplete. To seal this place was not to hide history, but to protect future generations from themselves. Their work was a solemn ritual of closure. Guided by Ancalagon's ancient knowledge of the mountain structure, they identified the key pressure points, ancient archways, fragile lava tubes, and resonant chambers that acted as conduits to the deepest, most dangerous vaults. The dragon did not use his fiery breath to melt rock into impassable walls. That would have been a violent, permanent act that left a wound of its own. Instead, he employed a more subtle and profound magic. Placing his great claws upon the living stone, he chanted in a tongue older than the common speech of men, a deep, resonant hum that spoke to the very bones of the earth. The mountain answered, with groans of shifting rock that sounded like a deep sigh of relief. The passages leading downward began to fold in on themselves. Stone flowed like water, not to collapse chaotically, but to reform seamlessly, leaving smooth, unmarked walls where doorways had once stood. It was not a barricade. It was a healing, the mountain's own immune system, rising to gently but irrevocably close a festering wound. As the last tunnel sealed with a final, grinding sigh that echoed into a lasting silence, Ancalagon turned his gaze upon Elara. The offer he made then was one that had never been extended to a human in all the long ages of the world. The history you sought to manipulate was a fractured thing, he said, the light in his eyes holding a new, patient warmth. You read the carvings of our fear and our failure, and you believed that was the whole story. But a song is not defined by its single most dissonant chord. If you truly wish to understand the power you almost unleashed, you must first understand the people who wielded it. Our history did not begin with the siege, and it did not end with our silence. He was offering her the one thing that could truly ensure such a catastrophe never happened again. Not a warning, but context. Not a list of dangers, but a full and rich understanding of the culture, the wisdom, the art, and the spirit of the dragons, so that any who came after would see not a weapon to be coveted, but a legacy to be honored. Elara accepted not as a scholar accepting a prize, but as an apprentice accepting a sacred trust. The lessons did not happen in a day or even a week. As they walked the safer, upper halls of Thangorodrim, Ancalagon became a living library. He showed her not just the grand halls of battle and glory, but the quiet places, the soaring observatories where dragons had once charted the paths of comets and given them names of poetry, the vast, acoustically perfect chambers where they had developed harmonies that could calm volcanic eruptions or encourage the growth of crystalline forests deep within the earth. He spoke of their philosophy, their deep connection to the elemental forces of the world, not as masters to be dominated, but as partners in an eternal dance. He explained that their famous fire was not merely a weapon, it was an expression of their life force, used for creation, for healing, for crafting artifacts of breathtaking beauty that had turned to dust millennia ago. The fear that had been harvested was a perversion of a profound emotional depth, a depth that also allowed for immense joy, fierce loyalty, and a wisdom as patient as stone. This was the true safeguard, the final and most important seal upon the mountain's power. A simple warning carved on a stone might pique curiosity or even invite defiance. But a true story, rich with nuance and humanity, or dragonity, would serve as a far stronger barrier. Elara, armed with this complete history, would not simply tell future seekers, "Do not go there." She would be able to explain why. She could speak of the dragons not as monstrous, fire-breathing hoarders of treasure, but as a complex, fallen civilization whose greatest strength and ultimate vulnerability were one and the same: the incredible depth of their emotional and psychic connection to the world and to each other. She would carry the true story out of the silence of Thangorodrim, a story that honored the dragons not for their power, but for their experience, ensuring that their legacy would finally be one of wisdom, learned the hardest way, rather than a temptation for the next generation of power-hungry fools. The final stone slid into place with a deep, grinding sigh that seemed to echo not just through the tunnel, but through the ages. The entrance to the Ether Forge was now a seamless wall of living rock, the mountain's own immune system finally sealing a wound that had festered for centuries. Ancalagon watched the last tremor of settling dust, his massive claws resting on the newly cooled stone, and felt a corresponding shift within the deepest parts of his own being. It was not a loud or dramatic feeling, but a quiet, seismic realignment of his soul. For so long, his entire identity had been built upon a foundation of solitude. He was the last, the final guardian of a silent tomb, a creature defined by what he had lost and what he was protecting from the world. His vigil had been one of isolation, a self-imposed exile born from the belief that his only purpose was to keep a dangerous past buried. But that was not what had just transpired. He had not guarded this place alone. He had not defeated the enemy through solitary might. The very act of sealing this chamber was not an act of hiding, but an act of partnership, performed alongside a being so different from himself, it would have been unthinkable just hours before. The choice to protect had not been made in isolation. It had been made in concert, and the choice to share wisdom, to offer Elara the true, unvarnished history of his kind, that was perhaps the most revolutionary act of all. It was a decision to trust the world with its own past, to offer context instead of condemnation, to believe that understanding could be a stronger safeguard than any wall of stone or jet of flame. This realization settled over him not as a sudden epiphany, but as a deep and quiet warmth, like the first rays of a sun he had not seen in an age. He had spent centuries holding the memory of the Siege of Thangorodrim as a weight, a chain that bound him to a narrative of failure, betrayal, and inevitable decline. He had believed that to remember was to constantly relive the pain, to be forever defined by that single, catastrophic moment in time. But now, standing in the quiet aftermath, he understood that memory was not a prison. The past was not a chain. It was a landscape, vast and varied, containing not only the valleys of despair, but also the high peaks of triumph, the quiet forests of contemplation, and the wide rivers of connection that had flowed long before the war. Remembering the fear did not mean he had to live within it. He could acknowledge the shadow of the siege, while still choosing to stand in the light of everything that came before and after it. His legacy was not a single, sorrowful chapter. It was the entire book, and he had just decided to let someone else read it. The time for farewells arrived not with ceremony, but with a quiet understanding that their shared work was complete. Elara stood at the mouth of the great tunnel that would lead her back to the sunlit world, her pack now heavier not with tools of extraction, but with the weight of a promise etched into her soul. She carried no trophies, no shards of crystal or ancient artifacts. Her prize was far more profound. She carried a story, not the fragmented, fear-stained history she had originally sought, but the full, resonant truth of the Siege of Thangorodrim, a chronicle of a people, not just their fall. Her purpose had been utterly transformed. She was no longer a lore seeker trying to harness a force. She was a chronicler tasked with honoring a legacy, her earlier arrogance replaced by a humble and solemn duty to ensure the dragons would be remembered for their wisdom, their art, and their profound connection to the world, rather than being reduced to a cautionary tale about their final, tragic hour. Ancalagon watched her from a high ledge, his immense form a silhouette against the gentle, geothermal glow of the mountain's inner light. There was no spoken goodbye, no grand exchange of words. Their partnership, forged in the crucible of necessity and tempered in the ether forge, had transcended the need for such formalities. A simple dip of his great head, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement, was all that passed between them. She offered a final, small nod in return, her hand resting briefly over her heart, a silent vow that the trust he had placed in her would be guarded as fiercely as he guarded the mountain itself. Then she turned, a small but determined figure, and walked into the shadows of the ascending passage, the sound of her footsteps soon swallowed by the patient silence of the stone. As her presence faded from his senses, Ancalagon felt the familiar quiet of the mountain settle around him once more, but it was a different kind of quiet now. The oppressive, grieving silence was gone, replaced by a peaceful, watchful stillness. He was alone again, yet the solitude felt different. It was no longer defined by the absence of others, but by the presence of a new purpose. The Alliance had irrevocably altered his path. He was still the Guardian, the last sentinel of Thangorodrim, but his vigil was no longer one of isolation. He was now the keeper of a shared secret, a partner in a pact that stretched beyond the mountain's peaks. He understood that the mountain's deepest secrets were safer, now not because they were hidden behind impenetrable stone, but because they were protected by something far stronger than any physical barrier. They were protected by understanding. The truth was now held in two places, within the sealed heart of the mountain, and within the heart of a human who would carry its meaning, not its weaponized power, out into the world. The secrets were not forgotten. They were finally and correctly remembered. Weeks later, high on the wind-scoured peaks, where the air was thin and the sky stretched into an endless expanse, Ancalagon found a new rhythm to his existence. His patrols were no longer the grim, solitary circuits of a warden guarding a prison of his own making. They had become something else entirely, a form of active meditation, a reacquaintance with a world he had only been watching from a distance. His immense wings, which had once beaten the air with the heavy purpose of a creature bearing a millennia-old burden, now caught the thermal currents with a lighter, almost effortless grace. He would soar for hours, his golden eyes scanning the familiar slopes and valleys, but his gaze was no longer narrowed in constant vigilance against a threat he expected to emerge from every shadow. It was a gaze of reclamation, of seeing his home not as a fortress under siege, but as a landscape alive with its own quiet, enduring beauty. The most profound change was not in what he saw, but in what he felt. The air itself, which for centuries had carried the subtle, psychic weight of unresolved anguish, a constant, low-grade hum of sorrow that had been as much a part of the mountain as the rock itself, now felt different. It was clearer, cleaner. It was as if a persistent, dissonant chord that had been playing just at the edge of hearing for his entire life had finally resolved into a peaceful silence. The very echoes of the mountain had changed. Before, a dislodged stone tumbling down a cliff face would send back a sound that seemed to carry whispers of long-fallen rubble and ancient collapses, a reminder of impermanence and decay. Now, those same echoes returned softer, simpler, just the clean, sharp report of rock against rock, a neutral sound belonging only to the present moment. The wind whistling through the stone spires no longer sounded like the lament of lost spirits, but like a simple, elemental song of air moving over stone. This palpable lightness in the atmosphere was more than just an environmental shift. It was a mirror of the transformation happening within him. The weight he had carried for so long was not a physical thing, but a psychological anchor chained to the memory of that single, catastrophic event. He had defined himself by the siege, by the failure, by the loss. He had believed that to remember was to forever carry the pain, that honoring his fallen kin meant perpetuating the somber, heavy atmosphere of their tomb. But in confronting the cult, in facing the very essence of that fear weaponized and reflected back at him, he had done something revolutionary. He had not fought the past, he had integrated it. By acknowledging the full, complex truth of his history, the pride and the fear, the unity and the betrayal, he had stopped the memory from being an open wound and allowed it to finally become a scar. A scar tells a story of pain, but it is also a testament to healing. The weight was gone because he was no longer fighting to hold it up. He had finally set it down. This newfound freedom was not an escape from his duty or his identity. He was still Ancalagon the Last, the guardian of Thangorodrim, but the nature of his guardianship had fundamentally changed. He was no longer a warden, preventing the world from discovering a dangerous secret. He was a steward, preserving a complete history, a history that now included not only the tragedy of the siege, but also the redemptive alliance with a human seeker and the quiet victory of harmony over terror. His patrols were an act of stewardship, a joyful refamiliarization with every crag and canyon, not because he feared what might be lurking there, but because he was celebrating what was finally at peace. The mountain was no longer a monument to a fall. It was a testament to resilience, and his presence in its skies was no longer a sentence of solitude, but a choice of peaceful purpose. The winds that swept across the high peaks of Thangorodrim carried more than just the scent of ice and stone. They carried echoes of a world changing. On certain evenings, when the air was still and the sky began to bleed from orange to deep violet, a new sound would weave itself into the mountain's ancient chorus. It was not the groan of shifting rock or the hiss of a distant steam vent. It was melody, faint, ethereal, and unmistakably born of a human voice. It traveled impossible distances, a thread of star-born harmony carried on the currents from the valleys and villages far below. Ancalagon, perched on his highest lookout, would still his immense body, his great head tilting as he listened. This was Elara's song. He could feel the unique resonance of it, the celestial mathematics woven into the notes, a signature as clear to him as a spoken name. She was out there, fulfilling her promise, sharing not just a story, but a feeling, a new telling of the siege that focused not on the terror, but on the moment the fear was broken by an act of unprecedented trust. He understood the profound courage this represented. She was not singing to glorify dragons or to frighten children with tales of monsters. Her songs were complex, layered things, telling of the beauty of the dragon observatories, the sorrow of the great betrayal, and the fierce, desperate alliance that saved the valleys her people now called home. She was teaching them that the most powerful force in the world was not the fire that could break a mountain, but the unity that could mend a broken spirit. She was turning the legacy of his kind from a warning into a lesson, from a shadow of fear into a beacon of resilience, and the people were listening. He could sense it in the very air, a subtle, gradual shift in the emotional fabric of the land, a lessening of the ancient, pervasive dread that had lingered for ages, replaced by a fragile but growing sense of shared strength. In response, a deep, resonant rumble would build within his chest, a vibration so low it was more felt than heard. It was not a roar of challenge or a cry of loneliness. It was his own song, a dragon's answer. He would pour into it the memories she had helped him reclaim, the quiet hum of 100 dragons under a starry sky, the warmth of a shared volcanic vent, the unwavering certainty of a wing brother flying in perfect formation. His rumble was a harmonic anchor, a foundational note of stability and age that flowed down the mountain slopes to meet her ascending melody. It was a conversation across the miles, a confirmation that her work was seen and honored. For any in the valleys who heard the distant, thunderous harmony that seemed to answer the singer's tune, it was a mystery, a legend in the making. But for the two of them, it was a simple truth, that the bond they had forged in the depths of the mountain did not end at the cave's mouth. It had become a living thing, a thread of understanding that connected the ancient past to the evolving present, a permanent reminder that kinship and purpose could transcend the vast divides of species, of time, and even of history itself. One evening, as the last sliver of sun vanished behind the western peaks, and the world was plunged into the deep, velvety indigo of twilight, Ancalagon settled upon his favorite outcrop, a flat expanse of warm stone that seemed to hold the day's heat long into the night. This was his time for contemplation, when the noise of the world faded and the sky became a vast, star-dusted canvas. He watched as the first pinpricks of light emerged, familiar friends, whose names and stories his kind had charted long before the first human cities were dreamed of. The constellation of the Great Worm, his own celestial namesake, burned brightly overhead, its starry form a constant reminder of the legacy he carried alone. But as the night deepened and the tapestry of stars grew more intricate, something new began to stitch itself into the heavens. At first, it was just a subtle clustering of stars he had never noticed forming a pattern before, a gentle curve here, a brighter point there. Then, with a clarity that made the breath catch in his mighty chest, the pattern resolved. It was not a random scattering. It was a deliberate, breathtaking design. A sweep of stars traced the powerful, graceful arc of a dragon's wing, while a cascade of softer, closer-knit lights formed the outline of a human figure, not standing in opposition or fear, but reaching upward. The two forms were not separate. They were intertwined in a dance of perfect harmony, the human hand resting against the star-forged scales of the dragon's neck. The dragon's head bowed not in submission, but in a gesture of protection and unity. It was a constellation that had never existed in all his long memory, a new story written in fire upon the dome of the night. This was no accident of perspective or a trick of the atmosphere. Ancalagon could feel the rightness of it humming in the air, a resonance that vibrated in the very core of his being. This was a sign, but not one sent by any god or fate he knew. It was an echo. It was the universe itself reflecting back the profound shift that had occurred within the heart of the mountain, a celestial monument to the choice they had made. Their actions, his decision to trust, her choice to atone, their alliance forged in necessity and tempered into respect, had sent out a ripple that traveled far beyond the physical confines of Thangorodrim. It had touched the fundamental laws of story and memory, and the cosmos was answering. He understood then the true scale of their victory. They had not merely averted a catastrophe or sealed away a dangerous power. They had introduced a new frequency into the world's song, a chord of unity that could counter the ancient, weary melody of division and dread. That new constellation hanging in the sky was not for him alone. It was a beacon. For any soul feeling lost in the dark, for any heart burdened by the belief that old wounds could never heal, or that ancient enemies could never find common ground, that celestial image offered a silent, powerful rebuttal. It was a promise written in starlight that courage could be found in connection, that the past did not have to dictate the future, and that hope could be forged in the most unexpected of alliances. The dread that had once flowed from the mountain was now being replaced, light year by light year, by an inspiration that would endure for ages, a permanent reminder in the heavens above that some bonds truly can transcend species, time, and even history itself. He finds his way back to the inner sanctum, the stone cradle where he slept for centuries, but nothing about it feels the same. The air, once heavy with the dust of undisturbed ages, now feels simply still. The shadows, which once seemed to hold the whispers of 1,000 lost voices, are now just shadows. He coils his immense body upon the warm stone, a gesture that was once an act of retreat, but now feels like one of simple rest. The silence that greets him is not the hollow, grieving silence of a tomb, but the deep, peaceful quiet of a library after hours, a place where knowledge rests, waiting patiently for the right reader to return. This is no longer a place of hiding. It is a place of stewardship. His purpose has been fundamentally rewritten. He is not merely a warden standing guard over a dangerous secret, tasked with ensuring no one ever disturbs the painful past. He is a curator, a keeper of the full and complete record. He guards the physical mountain, yes, the crumbled towers and the silent, grand halls that stand as a monument to what was lost. But more importantly, he guards the meaning of it all. He protects the profound lessons carved not only into the obsidian murals, but into the very soul of this place. The lesson that memory itself is neutral. It is not inherently a chain that binds us to past pain. A memory is a story, and a story's power depends entirely on how it is told, and more importantly, how it is heard. The Siege of Thangorodrim happened. The fear was real. The betrayal was a wound that scarred the world. But to remember that event does not mean one must continually relive the terror. To honor the fallen does not require perpetuating their anguish. One can hold the memory of a deep burn, acknowledge the searing pain of it, without allowing that pain to dictate every future moment. In fact, It is the memory of the burn that teaches caution, that informs strength, that forges resilience. The scar tissue that forms over the wound is not a sign of weakness. It is proof of healing. It is tougher than the skin that was there before, a permanent reminder that the body and the spirit possesses an incredible ability to mend. This is the true legacy of the dragons, a truth that now settles into his bones with the weight of absolute certainty. Their story is not one of mindless terror, of monstrous beasts who darken the skies with fire and ruin. That is a caricature, a fragment of the truth weaponized by fear. Their true legacy is one of immense resilience. It is the story of a people of profound depth and connection, who created breathtaking beauty and possessed wisdom as deep as the mountain roots, who fell not to a stronger force, but to a cleverly targeted poison that turned their greatest strength, their deep emotional and psychic bonds against them. Theirs is a story of a magnificent civilization that ultimately fractured under a strain no people should ever have to bear. And that story contains a warning, but it also contains an immense, enduring hope. It proves that even the most devastating fracture can be survived, that even from the ashes of near total annihilation, a single ember can be kept alive, not to start a new fire of destruction, but to light a lantern of understanding for the future. And he knows, with a certainty that feels as solid as the stone beneath him, that this legacy will not fade. It is no longer trapped within these caverns, dependent solely on his long life for its survival. It is now carried on the breath of a storyteller in the valleys below, woven into melodies that speak of courage found in unexpected places. It is etched into the starlight above, a new constellation, forever telling the tale of an alliance that bridged an impossible divide. The story is free. It will be passed down from one generation to the next, changing subtly with each telling, as all great stories do, but always retaining its core truth. It will endure not as a static monument, but as a living narrative, for as long as there are voices to tell it with courage and ears to hear it with truth. The dragon's rest, then, is not an ending. It is a vigilant peace, the quiet, watchful calm of a guardian who knows his charge is finally and forever